Hi everyone, my name's Isabel Stewart and I am one of the Wave Trauma Education Officers, and I'm just going to do a short video, you'll be glad to know today, around the themes of trauma and resilience. And to do this, I'm going to use the acronym of trauma, and key to what underpins and then what is integral to both those things of trauma and resilience is the whole concept of safety, context, and timing. So those three concepts underpin both trauma and resilience. So here is something I have made earlier. I hope that you can see it, and it's the acronym for trauma. T for threat, R for responses or reactions, A for acknowledging and attending to what is happening, U for unique, M for mitigating and managing, and A is for attachment. So I'm briefly going to discuss those concepts just in a little bit more depth. So bear with me. So T is for threat, and with COVID-19, everything that's happening at the moment, it is hard to ignore. And the language, of course, which is very realistic and very real, and that makes the threat more impactful, is that COVID-19 is often termed as the greatest public health challenge in our lifetime, certainly since the Spanish flu in 1918. And words like crisis and pandemic. So that registers with us. Of course, it registers with us and makes us sit up and take notice, both cognitively in our mind, but also in our body. So that is T for threat, which registers both in our mind, but particularly in our body. It is harder to fool our body than it is to fool our mind. And I'm sure as I'm speaking and making this video, and I've just heard about Boris Johnson, I'm sure the fact that he has now been diagnosed with COVID-19 has registered just not cognitively, but on an emotional and on a bodily level in his nervous system. So threat registers in our body, and particularly in our nervous system. Then I'm going to move on to R for responses and reactions, and really just to notice what our reactions and our responses are, and again be curious about it, and without judgment, just to notice what our responses and our reactions may be, both in our thoughts and in our body and in our nervous system, how we feel, do we get agitated, all those types of things, but without judgment. A is to acknowledge this. So we need to acknowledge what is happening in order to begin to deal with it. This is very important in any condition, with anything that's happening, to be pragmatic and practical about it, and to acknowledge that this is real. And any alarm that we might feel, and how we feel we are being tested. I'm going to use some of the language that you will have become familiar with since this whole pandemic, since this COVID-19 crisis. So really to think about how this is testing us, how we feel this threat, how this threat translates for us, what it means. Then I'm going to move on to U, which is unique, and to remember that thankfully we're all unique. We all have our own histories. We all have our own experiences, and we all have our own coping mechanisms and skills. And that is absolutely fine. And thankfully, we are all unique. And we also have our unique strengths as well as our vulnerabilities. And it's, the ability to acknowledge both. And under unique as well, and again, using the language of COVID-19, and I'm sure you've heard it mentioned lots of times, PPE. And in terms of trauma and resilience, I want you to think about, well, what personal protective equipment do we have, or do we need to deal with what is happening now, and the threat or potential threat to us and our families. So I want you to think about what our own personal protective equipment is, whether that's, physically, psychologically, and just like the nurses and doctors say, how can we, if the threat increases, what do we need to do to rise to that challenge to enhance our own protective personal equipment as well? And then move on to M, which is about mitigating and managing. So how will we try to mitigate and manage the threat, to rebalance ourselves? And things are changing so fast. It's a big ask, but it's very important to think about how we manage what is happening. It unbalances us. So what do we use? What skills, what methods we use to rebalance ourselves? And I know I've been doing things like planting strawberries, which I've never done in my life, and growing things, doing more walking, maybe a bit more exercise. So it's whatever works for people, and whatever helps them to try to stay in balance in this very, very fast changing situation. That's important, what works for you. And there's lots of stuff on the internet and lots of tips and breathing, practical things, whatever works for you. And last but not least, A is for attach. And by attach, I mean and attend to what works for us. And I know a huge mitigating factor for traumatic stress is attachment and connection. And I have mentioned this before in one of our videos, and it was very telling last night when everybody was out in the street where I lived, and I felt very more attached to those people, even though there was the social distance, which we have to do, but there seems to have been more attachment in very many ways, people asking for help, trying to help other people. So that is a huge mitigating factor, and we know all this from the research. So ways that we can attach, and people have been telling me, more people have been getting in touch with Zoom, via the radio, television, Zoom, Skype, all those things, even though we're socially distanced, that there is forms of attachment, and that certainly helps us rebalance. So as I promised, I have said I will keep this short. So please keep yourselves safe, and thank you. Take care. Bye bye.